A bank robber and a professional forger who baffled all of France for 20 years. He stole and forged tens of millions and hit the strongest banks in France, Spain, and even the US. In the end, after all that, he continued his life as an ordinary construction worker, living on a limited income. Here, you wonder why he did all this, and where all that money went. Today's story is about the life of an extraordinary man. But before we get into the story, I'd like to thank you for your amazing engagement. I can't believe I've reached 4,000 hours of watch time on the channel and more than 250 subscribers in less than 3 weeks. Because of your support, I'll make all the stories visible with quality editing. I won't post any more audio-only stories on this channel. I just hope you'll share the video, leave a like, and subscribe so we can hit 1,000 subscribers next month. Now, without further ado, let's get started. The story I'm talking about today has 2 versions, one documentary and the other dramatic. Of course, the dramatic version added a lot of drama and has some slightly different events. So, I'm mainly going to rely on the documentary to tell the story. The problem is, the documentary told the events in a confusing way. They mixed up the past, present, and future, and didn't tell the story in a clear, chronological order. So, I'll be telling it in a more organized way. Our story is about a Spanish man named Lucio Urtubia, and this is a picture of him when he was young. And here's a picture of him in 2020, the year he died. Lucio was born in 1931. He was born and raised in a small Spanish town called Cascante. When he was 14, his father got sick and was bedridden. After examining him, they discovered he had a severe form of cancer, and the disease had spread throughout his body. His father was in pain and suffered greatly. One day, while lying in bed, Lucio's father called him and said, "Son, I'm in unbearable pain. I can't stand it. Go to your Uncle Pablo and ask him to lend us a little money to buy medicine." Uncle Pablo was one of the town's merchants, and he was a wealthy man. When Lucio's father fell ill, Uncle Pablo had told him, "God willing, you'll recover, and if you need anything, I'll be there for you." So, Lucio took him at his word and sent his son to ask for help. Lucio went to Uncle Pablo and said, "Uncle, my father is in really bad shape. He can't take it anymore. We need your help. We need some money to buy morphine to ease his pain." Uncle Pablo responded coldly, "I can't help, and honestly, I only said that to your dad to comfort him and lift his spirits." From that moment, Lucio started to hate merchants and rich people, especially since he was watching his father suffer more and more every day, feeling helpless, unable to do anything, and none of these wealthy people were willing to help. His father's illness kept getting worse by the day. And imagine, one day, his father called him and said, "Son, I feel like I want to die. Can you kill me? I can't take the pain anymore. Kill me." At that moment, Lucio's heart completely broke. I mean, what's worse than hearing your father say, "Son, kill me, I can't take it"? It's something that would crush mountains, let alone a 14-year-old boy hearing that from his dad. Lucio was mentally shattered because he couldn't help his father, and his hatred for the rich grew even stronger inside him.
Se me parte el alma porque es acojonante ver que tu padre te está reclamando que lo mates para no sufrir por un puñado de dinero, por un puñado de pesetas. Lo ves agonizando y lo ves muriendo. Y claro, pues uno está dispuesto a cualquier cosa.
Out of his overwhelming grief for his father, he decided to try something crazy. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen and went to the small bank in town. He was watching the teller counting money, and he was serious about the idea of attacking her with the knife and killing her to take the money. But despite everything, Lucio couldn't bring himself to do it. After a period of internal struggle and pain, Lucio's father passed away on his deathbed. There's something important to mention. Lucio's father was a communist. This communist ideology, at least from what I understand, opposes wealthy people and is against capitalism. Lucio's father's attachment to this ideology was one of the reasons Lucio grew to hate the rich, banks, companies, and even governments. Keep that in mind because it'll play a big role in the story. Anyway, after his father died, Lucio continued living and struggling for a while. He had one brother and 3 sisters. His brother moved to a city on the French-Spanish border and took Lucio with him. There, the 2 of them started working in smuggling, moving contraband from Spain to France and vice versa. During that time, it was the first phase of Lucio's life where he gained experience in the underground world, the world of gangs. But he had to leave that job because of mandatory military service in Spain, where he was forced to join the army. While in the army, Lucio moved from one post to another and from one task to another. But the job he wanted the most was working in the food supply unit, the group responsible for distributing food in the army, managing the food warehouses. Finally, after some time, Lucio managed to join this food supply team, and he quickly made friends with some of the soldiers working with him. These friends agreed that they would steal from the army. The food warehouses were full of items that could be sold for good money on the black market, so they started stealing everything: blankets, clothes, canned foods, shoes, everything they could get their hands on. Lucio was happy that he was starting to make money from this job, but he was even happier that he was able to deceive his superiors in the army, which gave him even more satisfaction. But this job didn't last long. The army officials discovered the thefts. Luckily for Lucio, he was on leave when everything was uncovered, so most of his friends were arrested, and they were surely given severe punishments. As for him, he got the news while he was away on leave, so he decided, of course, not to return to the army. Not only that, but he also decided to leave the country because he was now wanted. The closest country he could go to was France. He packed his things and went to Paris, and what helped him was that one of his sisters was already living there, so she helped him get settled, and he began to adjust to the new country little by little. Any job opportunity he found, he would take, but after some time, he specialized in construction work and became a builder. Lucio was a hard-working person, and when he worked, he gave all his effort and energy to the job. This created some tension between him and his co-workers because they would say to him, "You're working too hard, making us look bad, like we can't work as well as you. We need you to tone it down a bit and take it easy." But Lucio's response was, "What's it to you? Do what you want, and let me do what I want." Lucio was someone who didn't let others tell him what to do. No matter how hard his co-workers tried to convince him, he refused and wouldn't slow down. His co-workers didn't hate him or hold a grudge against him, but they were puzzled by him. One day, during a lunch break, they were talking about politics and ideologies, and one of them asked him, "What ideology do you follow?" Lucio said, "I don't know. I guess I'm a communist." His co-workers exchanged looks and laughed, saying, "You? A communist? Communists love taking orders, and you're the last person who'd let anyone give you orders. You're an anarchist." An anarchist means someone who doesn't recognize authority, someone who is always against the system, doesn't like to be under any authority, or take orders from anyone. From that moment, Lucio began to adopt anarchist ideas. This ideology had followers, and there was some overlap between anarchists and communists, with political parties and groups in France. Lucio started attending these groups' meetings and got involved with them. These groups had people from all walks of life, and Lucio blended in with them and started diving deeper into anarchist ideology. Let's hear from Lucio himself as he explains the anarchist ideology.
Anarquismo, conjunto de doctrinas de los anarquistas, destructora de la autoridad y subversiva del orden social.
The idea was about building a free society where everyone enjoys freedom and equality, but without a government and without money, because they believed money was one of the greatest evils in the world, and that wealth should be distributed to everyone. It sounds nice in theory, but anyone realistic can see that a system like that is impossible to succeed in human societies. But Lucio embraced this idea and saw governments, institutions, and companies as enemies, and he became involved with this group. At that time, there was an anarchist named Francisco Sabate, nicknamed El Kiko, who was one of the most wanted men by the Spanish regime because he was one of the leaders of the anarchist movement that opposed the Spanish government. El Kiko escaped to France, even though he was wanted there too, but he needed a place to hide, and hiding in France was easier. So he sought refuge with anarchist friends in Paris, and the first idea they had was for Lucio to hide him, since Lucio didn't have any criminal record. El Kiko hid at Lucio's place for a while, and during that time, they got to know each other and became friends. Lucio had heard about El Kiko before and saw him as a role model, so he was really proud to be hiding him and that they had become friends. El Kiko was also a professional bank robber who had pulled off major heists in Spain using armed robbery methods rather than tunnels or clever tricks. He even brought his weapons with him to Paris. El Kiko told Lucio he would train him in robbing banks, and Lucio was super excited, not for the money or the thrill of stealing, but because he wanted to hit banks and hurt them, seeing them as one of his biggest enemies. So, the two of them started carrying out armed robberies together, and Lucio began learning from El Kiko. But Lucio's problem was that he was always super nervous, especially during the first few heists, to the point where sometimes he'd even wet himself from the stress.
Claro que lo pasabas mal. ¿Cómo no lo vas a pasar mal cuando tienes un arma en la mano que no eres ningún criminal? Yo me orinaba en el pantalón.
For Lucio, robbing banks was just a way to fight his enemies. He wasn't doing it because he enjoyed stealing or wanted the money. In fact, he and his mentor, El Kiko, would split the money they stole into 3 parts. One part went to support their group, another part went to the families of their imprisoned friends, and the last part was used for future operations. Lucio and El Kiko kept up their robberies during this time, and El Kiko became like a father figure to Lucio, teaching him, guiding him, and even looking out for him emotionally because he knew bank robbery was tough on Lucio.
Ha habido intentos que nos han salido mal, sí. Mal sin que haya víctimas, ¿comprendes? Bastante violencia también. ¿Tú te imaginas lo que es ver a una persona, un empleado allí? Yo no he tenido, pero podía haber muerto.
After several heists, the pressure on El Kiko increased, and there was a fear that if he got caught, the French authorities might hand him over to Spain, where the Spanish regime would almost certainly execute him. However, if El Kiko turned himself in to the French authorities, he could possibly negotiate a short prison sentence and be released without being extradited to Spain. They discussed this among themselves and decided it was the best move. Better for him to serve some time in French prison than be handed over to Spain and executed. That's exactly what happened. El Kiko turned himself in to the French authorities under the condition that they wouldn't extradite him to Spain, and the French authorities agreed. El Kiko left his weapons with Lucio, instructing him to use them against the French regime if they broke their promise and sent him to Spain. But the French government kept their word, and El Kiko remained imprisoned in France for several years before being released. However, after his release, El Kiko changed mentally and became worse. He felt the urge to return to Spain, to his homeland, where he missed his family. Lucio advised him not to go back, to stay in Paris, but El Kiko couldn't stand being there anymore. He wanted to return to his country, despite everyone around him advising against it. On January 6, 1960, he set out with 5 of his friends to cross the French border into Spain. At the border, the Spanish border guards spotted them, recognized them, and a gunfight broke out that ended with El Kiko and the 5 people with him being killed. When the news of his death reached Lucio, he felt shattered, like he had lost his father all over again. During this period, Lucio stepped away from bank robberies. He didn't even think about them after El Kiko's death. Instead, he focused on his construction work and put his energy into helping the anarchist group spread their ideas. One of the things they needed was printed materials, as they needed to print books, flyers, and pamphlets to promote their ideas. Unfortunately, they didn't have enough money to open a print shop, and no printing press would agree to print the stuff they wanted. So, they went to the bank. But this time, not to rob it, but to ask for a loan to help them open a print shop. The bank manager told them there was no way he could give them a loan because they didn't have any assets or steady income to guarantee repayment. So, Lucio and his friends left the bank empty-handed. At that point, Lucio saw no other option but to return to robbing banks, even though he didn't like that option. He wanted to rob the banks, but he didn't want to point guns at people. In the end, though, he felt he had no choice. So, he and one of his friends went out, took the weapons El Kiko had left them, and stormed the very same bank they had asked for a loan. After threatening the employees with guns, they stole a large sum of money, and were able to use that money to open a print shop to serve their group and spread their ideas. They started printing their pamphlets and papers to promote their ideology and cause. But one day, Lucio had a thought. Since they now had their own printing press, why not use it for counterfeiting to support their cause? If they could forge official documents and passports, both French and Spanish, it would be a huge help. One day, he said to his friends, "What do you think? Wouldn't it be easy if we started forging Spanish IDs? We could help a lot of our friends." They laughed at him and said, "The Spanish ID is one of the hardest things to forge because it's got 7 colors layered in a complex way." But Lucio saw it as a challenge and managed to find someone skilled and experienced in this area who shared their beliefs. This forger's name was Lorione Serrade. Thanks to Lorione, Lucio was able to start the counterfeiting operations, and they began producing fake IDs, passports, and other official documents. They distributed these documents to their friends in Spain and France, making it easier for them to navigate government systems, banks, and even cross borders. This project grew larger in 1968, specifically in May. During that month, France was going through a period of intense protests, and, of course, Lucio and the anarchist group supported any demonstrations or revolutionary movements against governments and regimes. They used their printing press to support these protests. During this time, Lucio met a French girl named Anne, who was also involved in the protests and had a natural leadership spirit. They got to know each other, fell in love, and eventually got married. Though her father wasn't entirely happy with her choice, but agreed reluctantly. Lucio didn't hide anything from Anne. He told her everything about himself, his beliefs, and even confessed about the document forgery. But none of this changed her feelings for him. She loved him even more and became intellectually attracted to him, eventually joining the anarchist group. In that period, the 1960s, there were conflicts between Cuba and America. You might ask, what does that have to do with us? We're talking about Spain and France. So how are we connected to Cuba and America? Don't rush, my friend, because this is important to our story. At that time, there was a military revolution in Cuba led by a man named Fidel Castro and his comrade Che Guevara. They managed to gather the people and ignite a major revolution that overthrew the Cuban regime. Afterward, Castro became the country's president, and Guevara became the Minister of Industry and Finance. Both Guevara and Castro were aligned with Marxist communism, and America was an enemy of this ideology. After the revolution's success, and Castro and his comrade came to power, a strong hostility developed between America and Cuba, with constant tension that a war could break out, especially after the Soviet Union placed nuclear missile bases on Cuban soil. Now that we understand the background, let's return to Lucio and the anarchist group. Naturally, their ideology aligned with the communists, and they closely followed the news. They supported Castro's regime in Cuba and wanted to help in any way possible. Lucio came up with a crazy idea. Why not counterfeit US dollars? He began working on this complex project with the help of his expert forger friend, Lorion Serrad. The US dollar was extremely difficult to counterfeit and create professional quality replicas of. Lucio and his buddy spent some time working on perfecting the printing plates, and finally, after a lot of hard work, they had plates that could print counterfeit dollars that no one could tell apart from the real ones unless they were an expert. They even tested it out by going to banks and exchanging the fake dollars for French francs, and everything went smoothly. The bank tellers, who were supposed to be currency experts, couldn't tell the money was fake. Their copies were that professional. Of course, Lucio's main goal with this counterfeiting wasn't to get rich. It was always about supporting his cause. Now, with this new weapon in his hands, he wanted to use it to help Cuba fight against America. Imagine, Lucio had connections with the Cubans, and even personally knew the Cuban ambassador in France. So, imagine he went to the ambassador all excited and said, "I can print counterfeit dollars that no one can tell are fake. And we can use this as a weapon to hurt the American economy. If we print millions of dollars and flood the market, we can crash their economy." The ambassador was shocked by the suggestion. She never expected something like this. But on the other hand, she liked the idea. Still, she told Lucio, "Look, I can't move forward with this on my own, but Che Guevara is coming to France in the next few weeks, and I can arrange for you to meet with him to pitch your idea directly." Lucio said, "Great, set up the meeting, and I'll talk to Guevara." At that time, Guevara was Cuba's Minister of Finance, traveling to various countries in the Middle East and Europe to advance Cuba's interests. During his trip, he was going to stop in France. The ambassador set up a meeting for Lucio with Guevara, but it was at the airport, meaning it would be a quick encounter. The days passed, and the meeting day came. Lucio went to the airport, and sure enough, he met Guevara. Here's an actual picture of the two of them together. Lucio was excited, telling Guevara about his plan, saying, "I'll provide you with professional printing plates that no one can tell from real dollars. All we need from the Cuban government is to do the printing, and together, we can produce massive amounts of dollars and cripple the American economy." Lucio believed that Cuba was willing to do anything to take down America. As a country, they had banks, militias, followers all over the world, and strong popular support in many countries. Guevara himself was a well-known figure among people of all classes and races, and if they executed this plan together, Lucio thought it would definitely succeed. But Lucio was stunned by Guevara's cold response. Guevara told him, "You're like a fly trying to kill an elephant. The American economy is too big to be shaken or affected by a cheap stunt like this. Your idea won't work." Guevara's response was cold and dismissive, showing no interest in the plan.
Mal no me cayó bien. Lo vi frío. Esa inteligencia que podía haber tenido hacia mí.
After that, Lucio decided not to waste any more time on the Cuba idea and refocused on his friends and those around him. But his meeting with Guevara had caught the attention of the French police even more. They were already monitoring him as someone who could be a threat to the government, and they were almost certain he was involved in bank robberies, but they didn't have any proof. All they could do was keep an eye on him, but Lucio was smart and didn't give them any openings to arrest him. He used his construction skills to build underground storage spaces where he kept illegal items like weapons or forged documents. What also helped him was that he never took any money from the robberies or forgery operations he ran. All the money went to supporting his group and their cause. Many people even started seeing Lucio as a Robin Hood figure, stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Lucio didn't live a life of luxury or excess. He still worked in construction. As the days and years went by, Lucio had a daughter, and his focus on his family grew. But he still continued to support his group. At one point, Lucio noticed that many businesses and companies started using checks to pay their workers' wages. Instead of giving them cash, they'd give them a check for the amount, and the workers could take that check to the bank or even cash it at the supermarket. That's when Lucio had another idea. Why not start forging checks? So Lucio brought in his forgery expert friend, and they sat down together to discuss the plan. The expert told him that forging these checks would be easier than the passports and IDs they had already successfully faked, so they were confident they could pull it off. Lucio got excited and gathered the rest of his crew to start planning their new project, one that would support their cause and hit their number one enemy, the banks. Their first targets were Spanish banks. They started forging checks that looked like workers' payroll checks, even creating fake documents to prove that the person cashing the check was an actual worker. This made it easy for bank tellers to hand over the money without realizing the check and documents were fake. Lucio and his crew kept running these operations on a wide scale, and this was Lucio's first major blow. Now, he had to move on to the second hit, and it had to be bigger and stronger. This time, Lucio chose a tougher, more aggressive target: the American banks. The largest American bank at that time was Citibank, which was also the biggest bank in the world. The exciting part about targeting such a massive American bank was that its checks could be cashed anywhere in the world, not just in Spain or France, because Citibank had branches everywhere. But the problem was that Citibank checks weren't easy to forge. They had layers of security, making them even harder to fake than dollars. But that challenge only motivated Lucio and his crew more, and after a massive effort, they managed to create precise printing plates that could make checks identical to Citibank's. Most banks issued something called traveler's checks, which tourists could use in other countries. These traveler's checks were easy to get, so Lucio and his crew copied the serial numbers from real ones and repeated the same numbers on their forged checks. They printed a large batch of checks, all with the same serial number, and these checks had to be cashed all at once to avoid detection. Lucio was able to recruit many people who shared their ideology, some from distant cities across France, Spain, and even other European countries. Lucio created a network and started distributing the forged checks to them. The plan was for each person to walk into a bank at the same time, with each one going to a branch in their own area or city. They'd present the check to the teller, get the money, and then leave immediately. After leaving, another person involved in the operation would be waiting, and the two would discreetly hand off the money. So, even if someone from the bank or security was following them, They wouldn't notice that the money had been passed to someone else, leaving no trail. This way, all the fake checks with the same serial number would be cashed simultaneously, and the bank wouldn't realize what had happened until it was too late. Back then, there were no computers or the internet, so the forgery wouldn't be discovered until hours or days later, when the checks made their way to the main bank. And after sorting through them, they'd realize there were multiple checks with the same number. That's when they'd figure out they'd been scammed. The plan was so smart and effective that Citibank was losing millions of dollars and had no idea what to do. They tried to pressure the French police, but the police kept telling them, "We're working on it." Lucio and his crew pulled off this operation once a month, and on the day they did it, they'd withdraw millions of dollars from Citibank in a single hit. As before, most of the money went to support their movement and cause, and they kept only a little for themselves, so none of them ever got rich. Citibank's management was going crazy, not knowing what to do. They started blocking check cashing at certain times of the day and implementing a bunch of rules that made it harder for everyone to cash checks. Of course, this made their customers very angry. Imagine, these operations went on for 3 years, and neither the bank nor the authorities could figure out where the forged checks were coming from. Even though they suspected Lucio and his crew, they could never gather enough evidence to catch them. They were super careful to keep their operations hidden. But in 1980, Lucio made a big mistake. At the time, they were printing fake checks in huge quantities, and the number of checks they had was piling up. A guy Lucio knew, named Tony Sarra, suggested a solution. He told Lucio that he knew an American who was willing to buy these fake checks for 30% of their value, meaning if they gave him $3 million worth of checks, he'd give them $1 million in cash. Lucio was suspicious about the whole thing and this American guy, so he decided to investigate more himself. He started following the guy personally and had some of his men trail the American to figure out exactly what he was up to, just to make sure he wasn't shady or working for someone else. And sure enough, they didn't find anything suspicious, so Lucio decided to go ahead with the deal. The agreement was that the American would take $3 million worth of checks and give them $1 million in cash. Through Tony, the middleman who had introduced them, they set up a meeting at a well-known restaurant in Paris. Lucio and one of his friends went there and sat outside at the tables, with a bag full of the fake checks. What Lucio didn't know was that the American was actually an informant, and the whole thing was a setup by the French police. Lucio didn't realize it until the cops surrounded him, arrested him on the spot, and confiscated the bag of fake checks. Just like that, Lucio was put in jail for a few weeks. But during the initial trial, his lawyer found a loophole in the case. The loophole had to do with how the police handled some of the evidence and the way they arrested him. There were mistakes in how the case was presented. This allowed the lawyer to argue for Lucio's conditional release on bail. Despite the bank's lawyer objecting and saying Lucio would definitely run, the judge ruled for Lucio's release on the condition that the trial would resume after the errors were fixed. Once Lucio got out, he was shocked to find himself surrounded by the press and media, with everyone snapping pictures of him. This really annoyed Lucio, who was actually planning to escape, just like the bank had predicted. Despite all the attention on him, Lucio managed to use a fake identity to disappear right in the middle of Paris. He found an isolated apartment and stayed hidden there, with only a few trusted people knowing his whereabouts. He wasn't planning on going back to court or jail, but at the same time, he didn't know what his next move would be. What Lucio didn't realize was that the police hadn't lost track of him. They had been following him, knew he was hiding in the apartment, and were spying on him. They had bugged the place, opened his mail, and even planted microphones to gather stronger evidence for a bigger case against him. Eventually, after about 2 months of surveillance, they decided to arrest him again, and a new trial for Lucio began. Naturally, Citibank's management and their lawyers wanted to make an example out of Lucio and were pushing for the harshest punishment possible. They had built a solid case against him with strong evidence to ensure that he'd face serious consequences. The problem the bank hadn't anticipated was that the fake checks kept spreading and didn't stop. They thought after catching the mastermind, it would all end, but it didn't. On the contrary, the checks reached places and countries they hadn't before, pretty much all over Europe and even South American countries. This was terrifying for the bank. Imagine, it got to the point where the bank made a new rule that they wouldn't accept any traveler's check worth more than $10. But, of course, this just made things worse. Customers got even more upset, and the bank was getting thousands of complaint letters every day, with some even cursing them out. Remember, at that time, travelers' checks were Citibank's main product. There weren't debit cards or ATMs yet. Travelers' checks were the only way people traveling could access their money in other countries. So Citibank was in a terrible situation, losing tons of customers every day. It wasn't surprising that the bank went to court, aiming to get a big payout from Lucio. The bank's management didn't plan to settle for anything less than 5 years in prison or for Lucio to return all the money he'd stolen, plus compensation for damages, lost customers, and their damaged reputation. They estimated the total at $50 million. But with the bank's current situation and the continued use of fake checks, this gave Lucio a loophole to negotiate. He asked the bank's management to sit down with him at the negotiating table. Imagine this. He and his lawyers met with Citibank's lawyers and some of their top officials. During the negotiation, Lucio started laying out his cards. He told them he knew what was going on and knew the checks had reached Latin America. He assured them that the only way the fake checks would stop is if he stopped them himself. That's when the bank realized Lucio was asking for his release in exchange for stopping the fake checks. They asked him how they could trust that he'd actually do it. He said, "First, I'll hand over the printing plates we used to make the fake checks. We spent a long time making them, so they're identical to your original checks. Second, I control the network that's distributing the fake checks, and with my influence, I can stop it." They asked again, "How can we guarantee you'll follow through?" The tension was obvious among the bank's officials during these talks. Even though Lucio was the one in jail, they felt like they were the ones tied up. After a brief silence, Lucio got bolder and said, "I also want compensation for what happened to me." The bank officials stared at him, not believing his audacity. But after weighing their options, they realized their best choice was to agree to Lucio's terms, because putting Lucio in jail wasn't going to help them at all. But if they accepted his terms, at least they'd get the printing plates, no more fake checks would be printed, and maybe he'd follow through and shut down his distribution network, which was operating all over the world. After the negotiations, they agreed that Lucio's lawyer would hand over the printing plates, and in return, the bank would give them the money Lucio demanded. The exact amount wasn't made public, but according to Lucio, it was a huge sum. The exchange took place in a pre-arranged hotel room. Lucio's lawyer handed over the bag containing the printing plates, and in return, the bank handed them Lucio's bag of cash. Both sides confirmed the contents of their bags, and then they went their separate ways. Lucio kept his word, burned all the fake checks he had, told all his friends to stop distributing any fake checks, and announced that their operation was over. After that, Lucio and his friends started a company and began working legally. But he never gave up on his ideas and continued his group's activities. He lived his life in France, opening various businesses with his friends and family over the years, and lived a long life, passing away in 2020 at the age of 91. It's an incredible story, and there's a lot to learn from it. Even if we don't agree with Lucio's ideas, views, or actions, the way he lived his life deserves respect. Despite all the millions he had at his fingertips, he lived his entire life on a modest income. It's tough to stay that committed to your beliefs and principles. For me, that's something that deserves a lot of respect. And with that, we've reached the end of our story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Here are some awesome videos you can check out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care!